Koto. My name is George Weeks, and I'm going to talk about the art of the possible. In other words, how we can use our transport system to make our lives better. Now, a bit of context. I'm European. I grew up in Bristol, a city famous for Concorde and the Clifton Suspension Bridge, and I worked for many years as an urban designer at Transport for London. That isn't me. And then I moved to the Auckland Design Office 6 years ago to refresh the Auckland City Centre Master Plan and to go sailing at the weekends. And I still live in Auckland, but I do actually enjoy travelling south of the Bombay Hills, and it's a real treat to be here in Christchurch. But I'm sure some of you are thinking, why the hell is an Aucklander from Europe here talking about urban transport in Christchurch? Christchurch's history is completely unique, and we're different. Our urban planning history is different. And I agree. So let's go somewhere else. Let's fly far, far away to a different continent. I want to take us away to a big country that many of us have visited on holiday, who have flown through. I'm talking about the country that practically invented the car and which makes millions of cars every year. A country where every city had tramways up until the 1930s and removed them all in the 50s and instead to build urban motorways, ripping through the urban fabric and making space for public housing projects on the edge of the cities. And all of this while building one of the most monumental expressway networks in the world. I'm talking about a country that loves to build monuments. Its most famous monument is the Statue of Liberty. So by now you've probably realized I'm talking about my favorite country, France. And while our image of urban France is of elegance and beauty, much of France actually looks more like this. This could be the Auckland Central Motorway Junction, but it's the Bungale interchange in Paris. And you can see this scene in almost any country in Europe, like Spain, for instance. This is Bilbao, pretty ugly scene, isn't it? Even though most of the images that us have of Bilbao, if we have one, is the stunning Guggenheim Museum, even though for everyday life, the Bilbao Metro is much, much more useful. Now, my beef is that it's inaccurate to claim that livable cities are somehow inevitably European or in European DNA, but it's really amazing the rubbish that people will spout about Europe. For example, let's go to Europe and learn about some European myths. I mean, first things first, it's far too complicated to think of it as 44 separate states. So let's just have the myth that Europe's one big homogeneous country, the Republic of Europe, much simpler. And in this Republic of Europe, every city is thousands and thousands of years old. And in return, I raise you Milton Keynes in England, which itself is fascinating, but it's not very old. And in the Republic of Europe, apparently car parking isn't an issue. Now, this claim at the top is an astonishing claim. Maybe it's based upon early 20th century Impressionism, because while Paris is a historic city, it looks like this. Paris is a modern city with modern city problems. And if you try and remove car parking in Paris, you get this. And in the Republic of Europe, everyone always cycles for everything because it's in their European DNA. But really, there's huge variation. British people cycle about as much as Canadians. The French are slightly keener. The Dutch cycle the most. The Belgians are just next door to the Netherlands, but Belgians cycle much less, even though their geography is almost identical. Similarly, in the Republic of Europe, every car is tiny because all cities are old and all European countries are always anti-car. But that's rubbish. If you want to buy a luxury car that isn't a Tesla or a Lexus, chances are it's German. And the received wisdom that Europeans don't buy utes, well, that's rubbish too. This is definitely a Ford Raptor, and this is definitely taken in Prague. And statements like this are really unhelpful and untrue because they imply that utes are in Kiwi DNA, and there's nothing we can do about it, and that's rubbish. So my overall point is that while the Republic of Europe is homogeneous, historic, and quaint, this isn't accurate. Cities in other parts of the world have just the same problems that we do. So let's stop talking about Europe as if it's one big, very quaint republic. It really, really isn't. For a start, there are 44 countries in Europe, including 12 monarchies. Each one has its own history, traditions, and folklore, and there's huge regional variation within, like the varieties of French cheese. And some countries have very high population densities. New Zealand's at the lower end of comparables. We're slightly denser than Finland, a bit less dense than Sweden. Similarly, some European countries are very, very urban. New Zealand is more urbanized than Finland. It's about the same as Sweden. And financially, New Zealanders, we're about as rich as Brits. We're about the same as the Swedes. We're poorer than the Swiss, but who isn't? And we're richer than the Greeks. So let's just collate this information for a second. So our population density is low, like Russia and much of Northern Europe. And we're an urbanized country. We've got much more in common with Norway, Sweden, and Finland than we do with Russia and the Baltics. And we're a well-off country. Goodness me, what happened to my slides? There, that's better. Yeah, we're a well-off country, but we're not as rich as Norway. We're more in Sweden and Finland's camp, particularly Finland. It's our nearest twin in Europe, really. But you might say, well, very nice, but how does this geography lesson have anything whatsoever to do with transport planning in Christchurch? Well, two reasons. Firstly, countries in Europe vary hugely from one to the next. So let's not talk about a European population density because there's no such thing. And secondly, New Zealand has lots in common with many countries in Europe in terms of economics and population. Well, what of it? Well, New Zealand's land use transport system gives us about the only country in the OECD where road deaths are increasing, gives us a rotten productivity rate, one of the highest obesity rates in the world. In 2021, the Helen Clark Foundation said transport policy and investment will need to focus on basically making life better for people who are disadvantaged and reducing dependence on cars. And the rest of this presentation is going to focus unashamedly on public transport and active travel. Firstly, because we need to, and secondly, because these are the human-centered modes. I love this phraseology here about being sweet to the pedestrian and cyclist, because who wouldn't want a city with these characteristics? Imagine the opposite, a dull, ugly, dangerous city that's bad for your health. Who wants that? Like, imagine like this city here. Can anyone guess where this may be? It's Amsterdam in the Netherlands. And like many countries, the Netherlands went car mad for cars in the 60s, and Dutch streets were clogged with traffic. So what did the Dutch do? Well, they built urban motorway systems, obviously. This here is a typical Amsterdam neighborhood, and the 60s plan was for it to look like this. So this is the vision that planners had. They didn't build this particular example, but they did convert the main canal of Utrecht into a depressed expressway, carving a huge gash through the city. Now, as part of a plan to revitalise its city centre, Utrecht decided to give the space back to the city, and it now looks like this. And it will be even better as the trees grow, and it's a really gorgeous part of Utrecht. And this is relevant to New Zealand because we're doing the same sort of thing ourselves. Look at the old State Highway 1 in Taupo on the lakefront. It's the same principle of making space for people. And good transport planning makes sense in any country, such as using rail in a country with long distances through pine forests to transport goods. Going back to Finland for a second, or New Zealand, you don't need a high overall population density to make rail viable. But there's only 5 million Finns, same as us, but unlike us, the Finns actually managed to have a passenger rail network, shown by the thick lines, throughout most of the country, between cities and within them. Population density does not preclude having passenger rail. And with a highly urbanized population, like Finland or New Zealand, you can concentrate your high-capacity public transport to support your bigger cities as they grow. This is a map of the main public transport in the Helsinki region, where you have a metro. You've got, regional trains and a metro, and you've got orbital buses, and this is being replaced as a light rail to double its capacity. And Helsinki city centre is in this red square. And in the 1960s, the plan for Helsinki city centre was to build a motorway system like this. Now, this was never built, and the 10 tram lines in Helsinki were retained and enhanced, and the new lines are often very green, like this, and in the city centre streets, it's a very space-efficient transport system. It's rapid, clean, quiet, safe. It works all year round. And if passenger rail can work in the harsh Finnish winter, I think we can cope in Canterbury. Now, Scandinavia is looking jolly cold, so let's see what's possible in a milder climate. Let's go back to France. I do like France. And in France in the 60s, they really embraced modernity with the post-war economic miracle. So cars and jets and highways were in, and urban tramways, unlike Finland, were out. By 1980, only 3 French cities still had tramways. And these are Lille, Saint-Étienne, and Marseille. But in the 1980s, there was a French Revolution, and Nantes and then Grenoble built modern tramway lines. And these were very successful, so more lines appeared in the 90s in Paris, Strasbourg, and Rouen. And this revolution exploded in the 2000s, where there were tramways built in Montpellier, Orléans, Nice, Nancy, Bordeaux, haven't quite got to Nice yet, that's 2007, Clermont-Ferrand, Mulhouse, Valenciennes, Le Mans, Marseille, Nice, got there. And then this continued into the 2010s. More tramways in Toulouse, Angers, Reims, Brest, Dijon, Le Havre, Tours, Besançon, Avignon, Caen. Another tramways opening in Annecy later this year. 7 other French cities are planning, building, or extending tramways. And the French have really worked out the template. It's priority and dedicated space for your rapid transit, attractive modern vehicles, and improvements to the surrounding cityscape. I'm sure some of you are thinking, well, that's very clever, but how do they pay for it? Well, big French cities have something awesome called a versement transport, and this is a payroll tax of about 1% that pays for public transport. And it's a very efficient system because it's clear where the transport money is coming from, which means that the transport planners can focus on transport planning. And it's good value. This is a transport map of Marseille, 3rd biggest city in France. It's built metro lines and tramways so anyone can get to the city centre in 30 minutes. And the productivity and agglomeration benefits far exceed the costs of building a system like this. And you get a public transport system that benefits everyone. But it's not just about agglomeration and productivity. Let's go to Bordeaux, and let's have a look at the Bordeaux tramway map. 4 lines, all the same colours of red wine. And this is a system that was built by a conservative mayor seeking to boost Bordeaux's economy by making the city as attractive and accessible as possible, which meant tramways to move people across the city, plus streetscape improvements and a rising bollard system to preserve streets for people by only allowing essential vehicles. And the Bordeaux trams are great because they're part of the civic space. I mean, changing trams or catching one is as easy as crossing the street in a beautiful tree-lined square. It's an absolute pleasure to use. Similarly, in Paris, this used to be a 6-lane highway. Now it's tramway T3, and it moves many more people. And this was done by reassigning existing road space. Here's how it looks now. Here's how it looked in 2008. This is a very, very rapid rate of delivery, changing from prioritizing your traffic level of service to prioritizing life. And this approach also stimulates new developments. And by reassigning space away from general traffic, there's more space for people, like my friend's 4-year-old son, who was able to cycle with me and my friend from the Gare Montparnasse to the Eiffel Tower. Très bon. One more French tramway system, and that's the city of Brest in Brittany. It's a naval port, but it's not a very big city. It's about as big as Tauranga. But Brest, unlike Tauranga, has a tram line system that carries more than 12 million passengers per year. And it's rejuvenated parts of Brest town centre that, quite frankly, needed it. And again, with light rail plus public rail improvements, it's easier to get to and nicer when you're there. And there's little bollards to preserve the pedestrian space, and there's more space for everything else that we like. Now, a point I really want to make is that space for people is very, very easy to do because as a species, we're actually quite space efficient. Now, to illustrate this, imagine a person on this graph taking up 1 unit of space. And this is true whether they walked to this destination or took public transport. Or if they cycled, it takes up a bit more space for moving and parking, but it allows people to travel further. Christchurch, you're doing very well. I line scooted up Rolleston Avenue this evening, and it was very, very busy. Hooray. But as soon as you start bringing cars into it, you need a lot more space for movement and parking. And as soon as you start providing dedicated car parking, the space requirements get bananas, 90 times as much space. In other words, the space needed for one person to drive and park in a workplace parking space is the same as 90 people if they come by public transport. And to show what this means for urban development, here's Merivale in Christchurch, which was developed around tram lines and which is walkable. And here's Hornby, which was developed around cars. which is awful. And the transport system shapes our cities, and it shapes our streets, and it shapes us. And car companies spend lots and lots of money telling you that driving is freedom. But this is only true if nobody else is driving. Just try going to Burning Man in Nevada, the freedom to be stuck in the desert or stuck in the mud this year. Either way, you cannot beat the geometry of passenger transport. And real freedom comes when cities are welcoming to everyone, as we see here in Montreal. The best outcomes occur with a synthesis between great public transport and great public realm. And for a good example of this, let's go to Sydney, where George Street in central Sydney used to look like this, and now it looks like this, a complete curb-to-curb transformation, world-class public transport, bringing more people into the heart of Sydney. It's one of the finest boulevards in the world, and while the process of changing a busy city centre street from this to this was really very difficult, we've seen millions of passengers and billions of dollars of real estate development stimulated by this transformation, even if there's skepticism along the way. And fundamentally, a place that's easy to get to and nicer when you're there is attractive. And I want to talk about skepticism in my final example. And I want to start by illustrating an example of a nice Dutch street. And this is a Dutch street that prioritizes people. It's got brick paving, it's got cargo bikes, families on bikes, trees, benches, what's not to like. The funny thing is, it's not actually Dutch. This is London. This is a Waltham Forest mini Holland street. Now, Mini Holland is a programme led by the Mayor of London, which invested £80 million in 3 London boroughs, very intense investment to see if Dutch street design would lead to Dutch travel behaviour. And this basically consisted of filtered permeability in residential streets and protected cycleways on main roads. Here's a neighbourhood street in 2015, and here's how it looks now. It's a great space for shoppers, for cafe goers, for pub goers, for the bloke with the dog, for the people doing the filming. For the first time ever, all the retail units in this street are occupied. Nearby, the local square used to look like this. I mean, trees, traffic calming, quite nice. But now the square's twice as big, 0 cars, new trees, and it's a really delightful public space. At the railway stations in Waltham Forest, there's integrated cycle parking, and all of this incentivising has had a significant effect. People are cycling more, they're walking much more. This is unique within the UK, at least pre-COVID. Basically, rocket science, if it's easier to cycle and walk more, people will cycle and walk more. But please, please, please do not think this was an easy change. There was an infinite amount of skepticism. It was very difficult. When the first phase that I showed you earlier opened, protesters brought a coffin to the opening ceremony to proclaim the death of the high streets. They said, Mini Holland won't work. We're not Holland, we're London, we're different. After the success of Mini Holland, other areas in London proposed similar schemes. And they said, but we're not Waltham Forest, we're Hackney, we're different. And then other cities in London said, how about we try it? And people would say, we're not London, we're different. And then even within Waltham Forest, this street here with a dashed line is Markhouse Road, a main north-south road in this suburb. And the streets on the left side of Markhouse Road received Mini Holland treatment, filtered permeability, cycleways. And then on the right, when a similar scheme was proposed, they said, we're from the other side of Markhouse Road. We're 200 metres away. We're different. Exceptionalism is infinitely fine-grained. And look, change is never easy. It's human nature to be sceptical of change, and it's a bit of a survival mechanism. But I'm talking about our human environment. Professionally speaking, as an urban designer, we can shape the human environment however we like. So really, let's step out of our jail and really think about the city that Christchurch could really be. And we owe it to ourselves to create a livable Christchurch, one that is accessible to everyone and which can really flourish and grow. So I really want to not fixate on the obstacles, but rather fixate on this quote from Thomas Barter. Don't say it cannot be done, rather say you don't know how to do it yet. Thank you.